All right, today is the day I get to teach you guys how to make these adorable little Jane Austen inspired mini gowns. They are made to fit our mini bunny doll, which is a free pattern available on sweetbriersisters.com, and you can find the free dress pattern on sweetbriersisters.com as well. The first thing you'll want to do is go to sweetbriersisters.com and cut out your fabric as described on the pattern pieces. Once your fabric is cut out, we're going to take a removable marking pen and we're going to mark the gathering line on the front and back of the dress. This gathering line will be where the empire waist is gathered, right where on a person it would be right under the bust, but on the bunny they don't have a bust, so it's just right under their arms. And while you're at it, you can go ahead and mark the seam guide on both back pieces. That's going to show you how far to sew up the back seam, and then obviously because this is a doll dress, we need to leave an opening to get the doll in and out, so that will show you where to stop sewing and where to leave it open. Once everything is marked, we're going to prep our neck and sleeve linings. You're going to do this by folding them in half lengthwise and pressing them in place. Then you will fold one edge in to where that pressed line is and very carefully press that in place as well. And you'll do the same thing for the shorter pieces, which are for the sleeves. Now we're going to start working on our sleeves. You'll adjust your stitch length to a large stitch for a gathering stitch, and you will sew along the bottom of the sleeve, which is the longer end. I like to do this stitch a little bit more than a 1/4 inch in, so it's easy to pull out later on. All of our seams will be a 1/4 inch, by the way, except these gathering stitches, which I do a little bit more than a 1/4 inch, so that once we do the real seam, they're not caught in the real seam, they're up above it and you can pull it right out. Now we're going to gather that sleeve to make it a cute little puff sleeve, and you want to gather it to the length of that sleeve edging. So you'll just keep gathering it until it matches the length of that other piece. Depending on the kind of fabric that you're using, you might want to knot each end of that thread as you gather to keep your gathering in place. Once it's the right length, you can take your sleeve edge and match it right sides together. You're going to line up the edge that has not been folded in. And then you're going to sew the 1/4 inch seam down the edge. Once you're done sewing the seam, you can pull out that gathering stitch. Once you have your threads clipped, which is really important, I think, to do when you're working real small like this so they don't just drive you nuts. Now's the time when we're going to use those creases that we ironed in. You're going to use one crease as your guide as you fold that sleeve edge over your raw edge. And then the second crease that we did is going to help you turn the sleeve edging in on the back side. And then you can do this by hand or by machine. You're just going to top stitch to keep that edging in place. Obviously, if you do it on the machine, you'll end up with a seam that you can see. If you do it by hand, then you can do it more invisibly along the back of the sleeve. On nicer dresses, I like to do it by hand. On these quick cotton ones, I just do it by the machine and it's just fine. That hides all of the raw edge on the bottom of our sleeve. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to do the same thing with the second sleeve. So again, you just gather it to match the length of your sleeve lining. You're going to match right sides together, sew that lining on, pull out your gathering stitch, clip your threads, and you'll just fold that sleeve lining over again. Sometimes your sleeve gets a little bit bulky with all of that gathering and you can trim it, which is what I just did there right before I folded my edging over, and that helps it. It helps the edging to just lay better. After we get this sleeve completed, we're going to start working on prepping the back pieces. When you make a doll dress, obviously you don't make it like for a real person, you make it with that opening to get it easily on and off the doll. So that's what we're going to work on right now. We've already marked where the opening, how far the opening will go down. So you're going to fold from the top of the back down to that marking. So you're going to fold it in about 1/4 of an inch, and I do kind of like a triangle, so it's 1/4 of an inch wide on top, and then the tip of the triangle is that marking that we marked before we started sewing. And once you have those folded and pressed in place, you're going to go ahead and just sew them in place. Once these are sewn, if you need to, see how the one on the right is buckling a little bit, you can usually fix that with a good ironing job. Now we're going to go ahead and add the sleeves. So you're going to match right sides together and you're going to just line up that curve. It's the same curve along the edge of the sleeve as it is along the one side of the dress, and you're going to just sew it with a... Once that seam is completed, you're going to go ahead and add the front of your dress in the same way. You're going to match the front of the dress to the other side of that sleeve that you just sewed. And just sew along that curve. Okay, we're about halfway there. We just got to add the other sleeve. Match right sides together. Sew down the curve. Now we're just going to add that last back piece. Once all of our seams have been sewn, I like to go through and clip those teeny tiny curves so that they will lay a little bit better. And you're going to iron them all flat, which is a fun thing to try to do with such a big iron. If you have a smaller iron, I highly recommend using that. Now it's time to start gathering our neck piece. So you're going to, again, sew a gathering stitch along that long top edge. And so again, this is a very long stitch on your sewing machine, and I like to do it a little bit larger of a stitch than a 1/4 inch, just so that we can easily pull it out. You're going to use your neck lining piece as a guide for the length you want to get as you gather, but instead of gathering it, so with the sleeves we gathered it exactly to the length of the lining piece, this time we are going to gather it so that it is a 1/4 inch shorter on each side. So the lining will stick out a 1/4 inch on each side, so it's actually a 1/2 inch less than the lining piece. Once you have your gathering the correct length, you can go ahead and turn that neck lining piece in a 1/4 inch on each side and just press it in place so that you can remember about where that is. And if you need to, you can check the length of your gathering now that your neck lining is all folded in the exact length. Once it is about right, you're going to match them right sides together, and I like to pin this because there's kind of a lot going on. You're going to put the edge of the dress and line it up right to that line that we just ironed in, that is a 1/4 inch in from the end. And then you're going to line up the other end of the dress and line it up with the other line that we just lined in there. And then you can kind of adjust your gathering, make sure it's even all the way around, and pin it in place before we sew this on. And then you're going to sew down that edge with a 1/4 inch inseam. And of course, remove your pins as you go. Clip your threads, and just like on the sleeves, you are going to turn that edging over to cover that raw edge. And on this neck, you'll want it to lie nice and flat, so it is a good idea to trim that seam allowance to right. I probably trim it to about 1/8 of an inch above the seam. And then you're going to use those guidelines that we ironed in right at the beginning so that you can turn it over that raw edge. And again, this is kind of a longer one, so I definitely like to pin it in place. As you pin in place your edges, what you're going to do is you're going to fold in the end of the neck lining, and then you will fold down the lining around the seam that you just sewed, and that will encase all of the raw edges into a nice little corner. And you're definitely going to want to pin that into place because there's just kind of a lot going on in there. You want to make sure it stays together. You're going to do that with your other edge. So again, fold in the end of the lining and then fold the lining around your seam. And then I just like to go in and make sure that that neck lining is placed as well as possible before I go in and sew it. There's kind of a closer view of it for you to see those edges. And again, you can sew this on the machine or you can sew it by hand. Sewing it by hand does give it more of an invisible stitch on the front, which is nice, especially if you're doing more of a fancy dress. However, sewing with the machine makes it nice and sturdy, so if this is going to be a toy that's going to be played with a lot, that's something to consider as well, of course. Now we're just going to sew up the sides of our dress. You want to match the front of your dress to the back of your dress, right sides together, and you're going to sew all the way up the side and up that little tiny bit of the sleeve. And you want to make sure that you're doing a good back stitch, especially, with toys you want to do back stitches everywhere just because it holds things together really well, but especially on that sleeve because that's going to be a real tension point when kids are playing with this. You can also go in and clip the edge of the seam, the seam allowance in that sleeve, just to give the arm a little bit more room to go into the sleeve. We're going to do that with the other side. Again, clip your curves. You can clip that little seam allowance in the seam. Make sure that you don't hit your seam, of course, and then I like to iron these seams open. And again, I just like to clip the curves just on the bottom of those sleeves just to help everything lie flat. Now it's time to hem our dress. I have found that a more traditional hem where you fold the fabric up and then you fold it again so that there's no raw edge of the fabric showing at all was a little bit bulky for this scale of a dress. So I fold it up about 1/4 inch, iron it in place, and then I will just sew it like that. Otherwise, the seam just bulks way too much. Now it's time to sew a gathering stitch along that traced line that we traced right at the beginning. Again, with your sewing machine, you'll do a great big stitch for the gathering stitch and just sew right on top of that line that we traced before we started to sew. Now you can carefully pull that gathering stitch tight to gather that empire waist. The exact length that you're going to make this gathering area is going to be determined by your doll. So you'll get the gathering started and then you can put your dress on your doll and you can figure out just how much you have to gather it. So you're actually going to do a little mini fitting, I guess. So put your dress on your doll and make sure that the gathering fits the doll just right. And I like to tie the ends for sure on this stitch because we are actually fitting it to the doll. So you'll tie one end of your gathering stitch and then once you have the other end gathered just right, you'll tie it in place. Here I'm just smoothing those gathers out so that they were even. You can iron them in place so that they stay right where you want them. And then you're going to set your sewing machine to a normal stitch length and you're going to sew right over that gathering stitch. You don't even need to pull it out this time because it will be hidden with the ribbon. And that normal sew line that we just did is going to hold those gathers in place. And be sure to do back stitch on each end of that. And take your ribbon and you're going to put it right over that seam. And I like to tack it in place just under each arm. You can do that by hand or by the machine. Again, it just depends on any seam that you sew with the machine is going to be a little bit stronger for play. So if you're making this to be played with quite a bit, then I like to do the machine. However, it is a little bit more elegant to do it by hand. So if you're doing this for an older child who is, or just a child who's a little bit more careful with toys, then by hand certainly works great. If you're a grandma and you're just having some toys at your house to be played with now and then when you have your grandkids visiting, for example, then of course I feel like the hand stitching works just fine because it's not going to get a ton of play hours in. And it's time to sew that back up. You're going to go from the bottom of the dress just up to that marking that we marked before. That shows where the opening of the dress is going to start, so it'll be about halfway up. I like to clip the corner of this seam on the bottom so it doesn't stick out the bottom hem of the dress. And again, right where that opening starts is going to be another big tension point when it's played with, so make sure that you backstitch really well so that doesn't come undone. Our dress is basically done now. We've just got a couple little finishing touches. I'm gonna go ahead and sew a snap to the back opening. You could also sew on a little bit of Velcro if you're making this for a smaller child. I feel like Velcro is a little bit easier for little fingers. I think the snap looks a little bit more elegant, so it's just kind of that balancing game of how old the child is, and you of course want this toy to be able to be played with. Even if it's really cute and she can't play with it, then that's not gonna be great. So you just decide what's best for who you're making it for. The last little detail, I found that when making these Jane Austen dolls out of cotton, the cotton was great to work with. This is a quilting cotton, but it kind of belled out more like an A-line skirt than like those lovely Regency Era gowns. So I found that if I ironed it and kind of wrung it out while it was still warm, the fabric would take on a little bit more of a drapey look and look a little bit more Regency Era appropriate, but I would still have the ease of working with that nice sturdy cotton, which was nice. Now we're going to try it on our bunny and see how it looks. There she is, super cute and ready for her Jane Austen adventure. As I was sewing up this pattern, I wanted to find some easy ways to get a little additional detail into this gown without adding a lot of stress. So I did a lace overlay and a pin tucked version, and I just wanted to show you guys how I did those real fast. To make the lace gown, I cut out all the pieces out of cotton and additionally out of lace. Then, as I worked with the pieces, I would layer one lace piece over one cotton piece and just work with that as if it was one cotton piece. Kind of ignore that the lace was even there. I just went ahead and sewed the entire dress exactly the same as I would have traditionally. The only change that I made was when I hemmed, I pulled the lace up a little bit and I only hemmed the cotton piece. The pin tucked gown was even simpler. I just had an old shirt that had some pin tucking in it, and I fussy cut the pieces out so that the detailing was just right where I wanted it. You could do that with any kind of fabric, with any sort of detailing, embroidery, pin tucking, lace edging, anything to add just a little bit of really easy detail to your gown. I hope your gowns turn out beautiful. I can't wait to see them. Use the hashtag Sweetbriar Sisters to share them on any social media so that I can see them. And as always, if you'd like to see more free tutorials, it really helps us out if you like this video and subscribe. Thanks.